Hi, on this lecture I want to talk about the peritoneum, the peritoneal membrane, and the mesentery. Some of the structures of the urinary, including the urinary system, are said to be retroperitoneal. So I want to talk about these membranes. They're a little bit difficult to visualize. It's easier on a cadaver or an animal specimen that you can open up. But still, I think you can get the general idea of what the idea here is with these membranes. So let's start with this picture. And I realize that I made two slides that are very similar. So I'll try to make sense out of those in just a minute. But the first of these is this slide. And I put this one in to give us a chance to discuss the peritoneum. So the peritoneum, it's a serous epithelial membrane that is lining the abdominal cavity and the organs. So it lines the walls. This is the peritoneum and the cavity, or the organs. So the figure on the left is sort of an artist's idea of what's basically going on. So the circle is representing the abdominal cavity. And then running through the abdominal cavity is the intestines. And they've just sort of drawn that as just sort of a long tube. And in humans, the intestines are about, 26-ish feet long, about 20 feet for the small intestine, 5 for the colon. I'm not going to ask you to remember that right now. But it's a very long tube, and it's all coiled up inside this abdominal cavity. So you can sort of visualize it this way. And the peritoneum is the serous membrane. It's an epithelial membrane. It's stratified squamous epithelium. I'm not going to ask you that specific tissue type. But it lines the abdominal cavity. So, it's sort of going around something like this. So when you open up the fetal pig or any other animal, and you go into the abdominal cavity and you put your fingers on the wall of the abdomen. It's a very smooth membrane. That's the peritoneum. I'm trying to draw this right on the edge. And this is off, I'm not joining these two at the bottom yet on purpose. And this is referred to as the parietal peritoneum. Again, parietal for being on the outskirts. And then there is the visceral peritoneum, same membrane. This is one big continuous system, and it lines the intestines. I'm not joining those either. So that membrane that lines them, and it goes all along the outside, all of that is the visceral peritoneum. It's on the viscera. So we have the parietal peritoneum and the visceral peritoneum. And the next slide is going to talk about the mesentery. And the mesentery, this is all one large membrane system, and the mesentery takes off from the back of the abdominal wall and then goes out and attaches to the visceral peritoneum. And through that space between those two mesenteric membranes, it's like a sandwich. So I'm trying to grab both of those membranes in this drawing, with a pen here. And that goes to the mesentery, and running through those two layers of the mesentery are the arteries and veins that vascularize 26 feet of intestines. So your breakfast, lunch, and dinner and everything else is going through the intestines, and it needs to get absorbed into the blood, and it gets absorbed into the blood across this epithelium. and then goes into the mesenteric arteries and veins that you're learning. You've learned the superior mesenteric artery and the inferior mesenteric artery, and the same with the veins. So posterior, but we could write in here mesenteric arteries and veins. And they run all through there, vascularizing all 20 some odd feet of the intestine. So in a cross-sectional view on the right, it's the same idea. Here is we've opened up the abdominal cavity, and the little circles are representing part of the intestine. So what they've done, you can imagine this, if this is the small intestine, and you cut it right through the center transversely, and you look at it, what you're going to see, if you look at that on end, is you're just going to see a hole, right? You're just looking right down the lumen when you cut that. And that's what they're showing over here on the right, is pieces of the intestine or the colon that have been cut in transverse section. Kind of give you the idea. They couldn't do that for all 26 feet, otherwise the drawing would be a mess. So here is the peritoneum again. It's lining the abdominal cavity. So this is the peritoneal membrane. Here's the uterus. And it just goes all along the wall. And there's a root near the back where it starts to come off, and at that point, change pen colors to green. Now I'm drawing the mesentery. Gets to the intestines, and we go back to the peritoneum. And now I'm drawing the visceral peritoneum. And then we go back to the mesentery. And then we're back to the peritoneum. You hopefully get the idea. Don't want to belabor this all afternoon. So that's the peritoneum. Serous epithelial membrane lining the abdominal cavity and the organs. It's on the outside of the stomach, and which, sometimes they go by different names, but it's still the same idea. On the outer surface of the stomach. Okay, let's go to the other slide. Basically the same picture, but it gave me a chance to discuss the mesentery, which I put some yellow boxes, but it's nothing that we haven't already talked about. It connects the parietal peritoneum with the visceral peritoneum. So remember that the peritoneum is lining the abdominal cavity, and the visceral peritoneum is lining the viscera. And then again we had the mesentery. So I hope that makes sense. The next slide gives us a chance to talk about retroperitoneal spaces and retroperitoneal structures. So retro means behind. My kids say that I'm retro. My wife says I'm still living in 1974 or something. I don't know. Behind. So this is literally a space behind the peritoneum. And there are different structures that are retroperitoneal. So cross section again of the abdominal cavity on the left. You see the spine, so posterior and anterior, and this is all the abdominal cavity. Abdom cavity. And here's a little piece of the mesentery. And then it's lined with the peritoneum. They just kept everything with the red membrane. They didn't switch colors like I did. So notice that the aorta and the inferior vena cava are not flopping around loose out in the abdominal cavity. They're anchored to the back. There's the spinal column. It's anchored to the back of the spinal column. They're held there rigidly by this peritoneal membrane. And there are a number of other structures that are located in that retroperitoneal area. The figure on the right's a little more of an artistic picture. And what they have shown is that this sort of gold-colored piece, this membrane here, is the peritoneum. And it's been cut. And it's a little hard to appreciate the depth of the abdominal cavity, but all of the intestines and the rest of it and the liver have been removed, but they would be sort of superficial on top of this peritoneal membrane, because this membrane that they've cut, this is anchored to the back. So that membrane is over here. Yellow. So this is what they are showing in that figure, is that part of the membrane. And it's been cut, and you can see that some things are behind that. The aorta and the inferior vena cava, the kidneys, the ureters, etc. are all retroperitoneal. Okay, last slide. This gives you a mnemonic for remembering some of the major organs that are retroperitoneal. Now, I'm not going to ask you to memorize this list, but if you did have to memorize a list for another class, the trick for memorizing is to come up with little mnemonics, little memory devices, little sayings that help you. And one is sad pucker. So that's easy to remember. And then you just have to remember what each letter stands for. Things that are retroperitoneal. So I'm just running through this list just to kind of go over it once. It would be nice if you could remember 3 or 4 maybe of these items that are retroperitoneal, or if I asked you, true, false, the kidneys are retroperitoneal, or true, false, the esophagus is retroperitoneal. You should be able to at least recognize that. Oh yeah, that one was behind the peritoneum. So the suprarenal glands are the adrenal glands, aka also known as adrenal. They're suprarenal. They're above the kidneys. And the aorta and the inferior vena cava, we've already talked about those. The duodenum or the duodenum, however you want to pronounce it. This is the first segment of the small intestine. We'll get back to that with the digestive system. First segment of small intestine, or small intestine. The pancreas, the ureters, the colon. We'll look at this again when we get to the digestive system. There's an ascending and descending. Just like in the kidneys, there's an ascending loop and a descending loop, a loop of Henle. But as far as the colon goes, not the transverse section. So the beginning and ending of the colon. Kidneys are behind the peritoneum, the esophagus, and the rectum are all behind there. So if Sad Pucker helps you remember a few of those items, great. But I won't be asking you to memorize that entire list. Okay, that's it. The next unit we will go through is going to look at the kidney structure, and we'll be talking about nephrons in some detail. So it'll pick up a little bit on the next section. So, see you soon.